um, with the actual reality of opening a space in both New York and Amsterdam. And we did a public square where we just like basically live streamed our conversation about what it would take to open these spaces. And I thought that was a really nice moment of just like both doing the work of like figuring things out between us and letting that work be the public communication as well. So I thought that it would be nice to sort of do the same thing, but in a format that we could also like write up and publish and like put in different places in different formats. So with that in mind, like I'm happy to let the conversation kind of flow organically, and then maybe we can on the kind of to what we were talking about before, like it's difficult to know where people will be kind of coming at this conversation. So it might actually be useful to start with like the most basics of basics, which are just like what is index and what is post office, and then like kind of organically go from there. So I guess maybe a good place to start would be like when we kind of began to even think about these places and began to think about like why they would become what they have become. And I feel like
there's something really beautiful about actually in the very kitchen in Berlin of friends of mine, where I'm pretty sure almost to the day a year ago we had our very first like call about like the intention of like you guys supporting a space in Amsterdam. So I actually only just realized that today. That's quite a beautiful full circle that we're having this conversation today.
That's amazing. I'm in the same place I was too. So, okay, I think now that we're about, 6 months since we've opened our spaces, I feel super close to like, the operations of Index and like the day-to-day on the ground. And I wonder, Hugh, like you've been, on sabbatical and like on, traveling, like I wonder maybe if you want to kind of take us back to like our origin story as somebody who's like maybe like a little bit less like attached to the day-to-day operations. Do you want to like remind us why we started doing this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think what happened when we all went into lockdown during pandemic is we felt all of a sudden like really isolated and really lonely. But I actually think that feeling of isolation and loneliness had we already had it prior to the pandemic lockdowns. I remember that there was kind of like an idealism about working together, in the mid 2010s that I was kind of bought into. I've always been sort of like a collectivist thinker, and I think that the idea of a bunch of people working in a shared space together and doing programming together and coming together to discuss ideas has always been like a compelling thing to do. But when the pandemic happened, suddenly we were all like super isolated, and that isolation was super obvious. So we started Index Online at that point to get people who were all sitting alone in their houses to come together, and it grew in this sort of like peer-to-peer learning way to a point where we were having like 250 or 300 people come into these Zoom rooms. And what became clear as things started, lifting is that these individuals weren't going anywhere. They, still felt lonely. They still felt like they wanted to come together and learn together and have a space to congregate. So what we kept hearing is that these individuals wanted a physical space to go to. But what was interesting about doing all of this, starting Index Online during the pandemic, is that we had people all over the world who were gravitating towards these groups. And what we started to feel like is that there's kind of like this global mycelium network of people who are vibe-wise aligned with the way that Index talks and the spaces that Index was creating. And we wanted to make sure that when we create a space, that it's not sort of like centralizing and boxing out people who are coming to Index from all over the world. So one of the things that has always been a big part of the, the conversation of Index is how do we make sure that this sort of like this global mycelium network of creative and free thinking individuals can still be a part of it, even if we do build a space. So yeah, I guess that's kind of how it started, and that's why it's always been a conversation as to like, how do we have, you know, index nodes somewhere else other than New York City? So yeah.
Yeah, and then Brian, you were kind of connected. I you know, I think one of the nice parts about kind of combining our thoughts and ideas was that you were already like so far along with your concept of what this was, and it happened to be that it was so intersectional with like what we had been thinking about so much. And you know, I wonder if you wanted to speak to like kind of your origin story at all, and like when you why and when you were sort of thinking about these similar ideas from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think I mean, the feelings, you know, are, I think, very universal that Hugh just described, of like loneliness and unconnectedness, and knowing that like there was this energy of like wanting to combat that in some way or form. I think a lot of what people started in that somewhat gruesome year of 2020 was in that direction in one form or another. I think initially for me, it was in the form of first just a practice, just like with the center agency, like trying to figure out a way of working that could focus on not just these topics, but also working on them in a way that is almost prefigurative. But it was very still kind of online, and just like, and it felt like those ideas could actually get accelerated much more if there was a space for it where other people could come into it, other than through a Discord or something like this. And so I think it was that sort of thought, and maybe even I think me mentioning this thought, almost what I thought was more off the cuff to one of you or both of you, that then for you triggered like, well, actually we are actively thinking about nodes. And there was a huge, I think, I don't know, just like the way you recognize something that was maybe for me felt more latent, or something like a pipe dream, was such a beautiful coming together. And then I remember just one of the first questions that you guys asked was also about how for you it's very much like, what does the city need, or what does the location need of a node? And so what did I think Amsterdam needed? And that really, I think, helped a lot of thinking that I was already doing. All of a sudden was like, oh, actually what it needs is this thinking in a space. And so it just unlocked ideas that, like you said, were quite far along, but I don't think I had applied them at all to the idea of a space as much yet as it was ready to be applied. And so it was definitely this feeling of like, Amsterdam needs a physical space for people to get out of isolation, not unlike Index. But I think in Amsterdam specifically, it was also a feeling that there's such a history there of third spaces. Like there's such a long squatters history there as well. And some of the biggest sort of iconic institutions like Paradiso, this concert venue, started as a squat. This place called OT 301, which is also sometimes a concert venue, sometimes a club, has workspaces in it, studios, like it's one giant building. But they actually squatted it, then rented it from the city, then bought it from the city, and it's now in collective ownership. Those are all beautiful things that we have in Amsterdam as a history, but since that time, squatting has become illegal, and basically the whole city has become commercialized to the point where these third spaces are now in the form of a Soho house or something, you know, other places like that, where obviously commerce is much more at the forefront than the creative community they are purporting to support. And so it really felt like something that filled that gap was needed, that could speak to the taste level and the interests of the contemporary, but do it maybe with a different model behind it, and more freedom, hopefully, in that too, and a collectivist spirit, where the idea that like we can actually be more free in expressing our individual interests if we share a space and do that collectively.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I would really be so curious to hear from you guys. Like, how do you think about the balance between our squatters' origins, our like collectivist, mindset and mentality, our like desire to create spaces that are resistant to the over commercialized, over transactionalized like landscape of our respective cities. I mean, New York is so far gone in that direction. It's almost insane. And at the same time, what we're doing is we're working within that system. We are paying rent, right? Like in two of the most expensive cities in the world. And so it's inherently like we're inherently dealing with business and money. And I have been learning so much since opening our space, and learning so much about the balance of like hospitality and transactionality, learning to ask for what you need, right? Like things like that. And I wonder, like, how have you guys been thinking about, engaging in capitalism or engaging in exchange or transactionality in ways that are non-extractive and that are still true to our origins of being, artist run or creative run, collectivist spaces sort of for us, by us. Hugh, do you want to speak to that? And then Brian?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we're trying to do differently with Index is to ensure that people don't feel like they are being actively productized. Like the thing about the Soho houses and the WeWorks and the Neuhauses of the world is that they're definitely nice spaces. They're nice spaces to go to, but you can't help this sort of like underlying feeling that you are being both extracted from and also productized, because you get put on these sort of like these company-wide listings, and it's like, come work next to these companies, and suddenly you're sort of like part of the cell. And I feel like the problem with feeling like a part of the product is that you don't really have any transparency into whether or not you're being ripped off. So you kind of feel like you are. But then also being like part of the product line at one of these places also makes you feel like the spaces are not actually well equipped to have conversations that, critique the act of consuming them in the first place. So there's like a whole subset of conversations that we as creative people want to have in these spaces, but can't, because they just don't feel like congruent with even being inside of them. So I think that the way that at least both of our spaces have been approaching this, maybe, in different modes, but ultimately the same vibe, is we just involve the members in the financials of what we're doing, right? Like people know how much it costs to run our spaces. We in New York have quarterly town halls where we just talk openly about how much money we lost and one day might make. And we also talk about like what the members are needing in the space, like how can we upgrade it, how can we retain them, and ultimately we just want them to be owners in the space itself. And we have things that we want to do in the future to give them even greater senses of ownership. And I think that same philosophy applies to how we opened, how Post Office came about, because in a traditional sort of like space network model, it would try and look like a franchise. But the reality is we funded Post Office kind of like a grant program. Post Office is a completely freestanding entity that yields one free benefit up to its members, which is that anyone who's a member of Post Office can come to New York and work for free, and anyone who's a member of New York can come to Amsterdam and work for free. But other than that, there is no financial connection. There's no money flowing between these spaces at all. And I think that's integral, because we are a solidarity community. There's no transaction happening between these spaces. And that means that we can focus on creating the best environment for the right conversations to happen. And that's why people are going to gravitate towards us. I think like in a circuitous way, if there's a reason why people gravitate towards these spaces and want to be a part of them, it's because they're not productized in the way the other spaces are. So I don't know. That's my read on where we're going with things.
Yeah, our members aren't products. They're not users. They're members. Yeah, they belong there. Brian, do you have anything to add?
What's really tricky, which you maybe hinted at as well, is like, not just not knowing sometimes how people read what you put out, whether it's through the Instagram or even this conversation. but in general, like the terminology that we have to use and like swim in is like such overused terminology sometimes, even though we are being genuine with it. But you're right, like I think it's such a good point to make, that even though there's plenty of spaces that use terminology like members, like our space is really, people are truly members of the space and of the community, and have as much to say about it as anyone on this call. And I think that to me is sort of like the key of it. It's transparency. Like I think I remember one of the first things I was inspired by before I even talking to Hugh about just seeing Sanctuary Computer and Garden 3D from the outside, was the sort of yearly posting of the full financials of the studio. And I was like, that's just so fucking sick. Like a commercial, an entity that is, in and of the commercial world, because we have to be, because there's no real escaping it, even if you're a nonprofit. But to do that in that transparent way just completely changes the conversation. And that to me, it's like, there is all these squatters' histories, but that it can't really exist anymore. I mean, there are in Amsterdam people that are taking it back up, but that's more about housing rights and really about like people that just need a roof over their head, which is obviously like fighting a different but very important battle. But to create more space where people can start thinking about, okay, how do we fight the housing crisis? Should we join a squatters collective, or what does that even look like? You almost, you need space for the spaces. And to do that in a secure way, you have to play the capitalist game, but doesn't mean you have to sort of fully play it. And so to lean into the transparency, I think changes just fully the ground rules of how we all act and how people can act with us. And so, yeah, that's like transparent about your role, but also transparent about the finances, and making sure that people feel like they can change what the space is for. And I think in the long term, I mean, we've said that from the start, and it's something that, yeah, we're also still losing money. So once we get to a place of like equilibrium, then we can start even going beyond that. But once we get into a place of a surplus, how much of that surplus, if any, but I think some part of that surplus should probably be set aside to one day maybe buy a space and put in collective ownership. So we may one day actually be rid of still having to pay rent and still having one foot in the system. The long-term goal has to be sort of like, from the land up in a way. And imagine what we could do if we owned our spaces and didn't have to pay that rent, and how much we could then even more so give back to the members, or how much the member contributions then become sort of a resource to be shared again amongst members. Of course, these are very long-term goals, but what I think is also important, and I think great about what we're doing, is that we're saying, like, we're not going to wait until that perfect moment where we don't have to pay rent. We're going to start already offering some compromised version of it, where at least we can start coming together and having these conversations, putting out our values. And actually, I remember now from an earlier conversation, one of the first things, Ali, you said, of like, Index was so much about just putting out values, putting out what you guys believed in, and that created community, like not waiting for having a space, but you guys were already doing that online. So I think, yeah, as long as we keep having these conversations, setting our intentions, and people understand that that is the intention, and they can come into it and have an opinion, not just have an opinion, have a say in how we get there. I think that makes it an amazing sort of third space in the broadest sense.
Totally. And values transcend location, right? Like different, we can have the same values here and other places. And I think that's what makes the Index Node network a really captivating idea. I guess I'm curious, like, how do you guys see the Index Node program expanding to other parts of the world? Like, what would a new space coming online, like, what could that look like?
I think it has to start with that same question of like, what does the place need, right? I think there is sort of an engine now that I think I can almost not imagine another index node not having, although maybe I'm sure there is something that would be the exception to the rule, but like this idea of transparency, anybody that feeds into it gets to have a say about how that space is used. But the way that Index has a bit more emphasis on co-working, just in its general sort of model, co-working in the front, revolution in the back almost. And we don't have dedicated seats, but like also we're still like close to that concept. But I would love to see another city be like, we need a cinema. We don't have an art house cinema, and so our space is an art house cinema first, but then we're using the same rooms to do presentations and events, just like both of our spaces are doing. Or I don't know. I think that could be so exciting, and to see those same financial ideas applied to that of like, what does that mean? Like, if you buy a ticket for a movie, what kind of say does that give you, and what would that look like? How would that work? I mean, it's also just because I'm a movie fan that's sort of like where my head goes first. But whatever the city needs, like it might be an art house cinema that the city needs, or the town needs, or whatever it is the neighborhood needs. Could be a restaurant, could be a bar. But yeah, again, that question that you guys first asked me of like, what does Amsterdam need? I think is so we don't even ask that too much of ourselves. I think of like, what do we actually need? What do we actually want?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I agree. I kind of think that provided that Index is doing the work to uncover and empower people in those communities to serve their own communities better, then I think that it's going to be additive to the network by virtue of starting local and then expanding outward, for sure.
So transparency, we kind of talked about. Need, we talked about. I think those, like, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was like, are there any attributes, attributes that all Index nodes must or will have in common? And I feel like those are sort of the kind of core aspects are like, like inclusion by transparency, or participation like through transparency, right? Like the idea of not making your members your users or your products by like including them in those financial decisions. And then, starting from a place of need rather than a place of like imperial conquest. I don't know.
Or ego. I mean,
imposition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ego.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about like the way that
one thing I would add to that, maybe, which I feel like is implicit in what you just said, but I feel like is really strong in both spaces, and something that any node would and should have is also accessibility through some kind of public side to it. Call it public programming, but I feel like the way in which Index is a member space, but there are these opportunities as a member or as a non-member to also join events and see what it's about and learn about it, so that it has those sort of, those to me are the three pillars. It's sort of like, yeah, like you said, like financial transparency, members' voices to build and decide the space, and sort of a public connection to the public, and leaving the door open for non-members.
Totally. Maybe we can, for like listeners or readers who aren't super familiar with our program, maybe we can talk a little bit about like how people use or could use Index nodes. Maybe like as members, we talked a little bit about the public programming aspects, which, are inclusive to the broader environment that our spaces exist within. Hugh, do you want to speak to like the actual usability of Index nodes and how we see that evolving potentially?
Yeah, I mean, basically the recipient of a grant to build an Index node has one requirement, which is that they offer some free benefit to all members of all of the other spaces that are also in the network. So provided that you're yielding up that free benefit, you can build whatever space you want and you can serve your community in whatever way you would like to. So that's kind of like why we're doing this. Like this solidarity economy that we're building is far more important than any type of transactional one, for sure. But I think that it's also worth saying that these spaces tend to be good at doing a lot of things. Like our space is primarily a place where people come to work, but we also do a tremendous amount of events, both with our members. So members of our space are able to put on events and they're able to sort of like broaden their impact within our community and kind of cross-pollinate those things. But then there's also cases where people who are outside of our community also do programming. And then further, we're about to roll out our events offering. So where corporations and bigger companies might actually want a space, to host their company or to put on a dinner or, so on and so forth. We're also about to open that up, the space for those types of use cases as well. So I'm not sure if Post Office has the same sort of like offerings, but yeah, that's at least how Index NYC is usable to our broader community today.
Yeah, it's not dissimilar. I think because we're both as a space itself, we're just basically one big room, and so activities tend to kind of take over, and so we're trying to find that balance of like open to everything, but also letting it be used by multiple people at the same time. So everything is a bit more nimble, and we're trying to figure out how to service events that are maybe not coming from members. So far, it's just been a sort of reality of like a member kind of needs to take lead and take charge on initiating an event. So often it comes obviously from their own interest, but it is starting to happen now where, yeah, people from outside are like, they might not live in Amsterdam, but they're coming to Amsterdam and they want to do a book talk or something, which would be a great fit. And it's just about who can take the charge into, bringing them in and being there on the day and that kind of stuff. So we're figuring it out, but like the way that we've done it so far is that these kind of requests just get, posted to all the members. And if somebody's like really excited about it, they can take that up if they want to. And then there's always the option for people to become member so that they themselves are then, the member initiating it, which actually has been an interesting way to bring people into our community as well. Like there was somebody who was already doing a book club, but just didn't really have a consistent home for it. I was like, well, if you become a member, you can just do your book club here every month. And that's how she became a member and has been one of the more contributing members as well. So it's sort of like, it's almost interesting to see how when you tell people like, welcome to our space, you can do anything here, that people are really like, we're so not used to that it really takes some examples to make clear that we truly mean anything and everything. But yeah, that leaves the door quite wide open. And I'd be curious to see as we evolve how Index nodes, like what can we do? How can we benefit each other? I think just the exchange of information, these kind of conversations, just the sort of spiritual and emotional support of like, as we were building our spaces, like that kind of stuff is incredible and will continue to happen between nodes as new ones join. And then of course, if you're a member at one space and you're visiting another city and there's a node there, you can always visit as a member somehow. But I wonder what other things we might uncover down the line and what kind of exchanges might happen. I think that's an exciting thing that will continue to evolve.
Totally. Something that you were saying about giving people the opportunity to do anything and everything, and like the, kind of sense of wonder that can provoke. I've had some questions from people who like are getting to know Index about like, how do you curate your events? How do you like find people to do these events? How do you like make sure that the events are good? I've been thinking a lot about this question because we don't really have a curatorial process. Like we help people like hone and edit their public facing programs to make them like just based on what we've learned about how to communicate things like this. But it's not really like I don't really feel like it's necessarily our place to be like, unless it's really, really like value misaligned, to be like, no, we're not going to do, and maybe that will change once we like get further down the line and we have, we have to, there might be something that like forces us to make certain kind of decisions about what we do and don't host. But I've been thinking a lot about this idea that like Index isn't like a curatorial initiative. Like Index is a vessel that takes the form of whatever is inside of it, right? So we're just like a container, like imagine like a fabric sack, and whatever's inside it kind of like makes the sack like a different form. And I think that that's actually kind of like, I'm really inspired by that, just as, somebody who's both kind of inside the sack and like sometimes holding the sack, like it makes me kind of want to keep on engaging with this because it's not the same thing over and over again. It's not the same idea over and over again. I think, curation can become kind of a prison in some ways. And if we're constantly like taking the form of and reflecting like the changing and evolving ideas and desires and initiatives of the community, then like that stays really, really vibrant, I think. And it just personally is like a place where I want to be engaged in. And I think that there's also like an endurance aspect of that. Like curation gets tired, and I think if we want to think about longevity, like really being reflective of the people that make up Index in its respective places is like the way that we do that. So I think that looks like transparency and like inclusion and collective decision making, but I think it also looks like a platform and like a place to do what you want to do. Just something
that's it, I think.
Yeah.
I think do what you want to do. I mean, it's like the question of like, oh, how do you curate your events? And then the answer is actually we don't. But I think in what you said, it's like it all comes back to the sort of base values of transparency and needs, and it can be a bit daunting because we don't get the freedom in society today to ask that too much. But it's actually really exciting once you have the chance to do so and ask like, what do I actually want? What am I excited about? And allow members to tap into, in a way, and this is what I also find interesting, in a way, it's this funny balance between individuals and collectivism, where it's like, by being a collective, we actually enable individuals to tap into their own very individual specific interests. And so that's actually the curatorial program, is that like, because a member has to take charge on it, they have to be really excited about it to want to put the work into it. I mean, they get to use the space for free, or like they pay membership, and so the space is fully available to them. They don't have to rent a space to host their talk or whatever they want to do. But of course you have to make a flyer for it, try to get people to come to your event. Like there is some labor involved. But if it feels more like, oh, I get to do this thing, then people put that time in, and it's for their own interest. But at the same time, it creates this opportunity for people to come into the space and new communities to meet it. And so that, I think that has been working really well for us as well, of just like not having any conditions on what type of event we host, and actually feeling quite excited about the eclectic nature of the program that emerges from that, where it's like, we'll have private Magic the Gathering nights of members and friends of members, and then at the same time like a book talk by Helen Hester, and then the next week a water café workshop. And what do any of those things have to do with each other other than these are the interests of our community, and this is what people want to teach each other or learn from each other, and that's just really, really inspiring. And I think people are starting to get now, which is something that I try to always tell new members of, like, if you're part of our space, you have the full excuse to use us to reach out to your inspirations. So like that's been like one of the exciting things for myself. Just like I'm a fan of this magazine, and now I have a reason to be like, hey, you have a new issue coming out. Want to do an event at, you know, in Amsterdam, or if you're ever in Amsterdam, like let's do an event. You all of a sudden have this reason to reach out to people that you otherwise would have no reason to reach out to other than to be like, hey, fan of your work. And that's really exciting. And that's, I think, a benefit in a way that members can tap into that people are slowly realizing as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that we now have an offering as well. Like we have a contribution to make into the kind of like cultural, the cultural spaces that we might feel attached to or belong to. And especially in places like New York and Amsterdam, like where space is at such a premium, like it's a pretty valuable contribution or offering.
Yeah, I would also probably, I was also going to say that I kind of feel like if we were to be curatorial and we were to have a strong opinion about the types of events and the types of people that we wanted to come to our space, like we would be working against the type of company we want to be, right? Like we ideally want to be creating a sort of relatively neutral infrastructure so that the people who actually inhabit it can make it what it needs to be, right? Like if we were to be trying to curate it and trying to create like a certain vibe and put out a really specific opinionated message, then it's not the community space that we want it to be. It's not a place where the individuals bring what they need and ask to be supported from it, you know? So yeah, I think the hubris of curating anything under the Index banner like works against it for sure. And it's also why you feel like a product at all of these other spaces, is because you're fed their point of view, and you know, you can go to the meetup or not, but you can't like necessarily change the narrative. So yeah, I don't know, fuck curation. We're infrastructure.
Okay. What 3 learnings would you share with others looking to open spaces like these in their own communities?
Yeah, I think it's like it's all in the conversation we've just had, but I think we added that question also because if this is meant to be at some point looked at by somebody that maybe wants to apply or is thinking about opening a new space and wants to be an index node, and you know, we might follow this up later, I think, as well with even more practical advice, or we can always give more practical advice as people are looking for it. But I think all of us, before we started or opened our spaces, I think what we've been talking about, like, why do you want to have the space, and what is it for and who is it for, is I think the first question on a conceptual level to answer. Then I think on a second level, it's sort of like, how does that blend with the financial model of that space, and just being realistic about, yeah, like you said before, unfortunately, we are in capitalism. You're going to have to pay rent, likely. And how is that going to work? And how is that model for your space going to blend or maybe contradict the concept of that first question of the why? And it's okay if it contradicts it. I mean, it probably will, because we just have to be comfortable with living in a world of contradictions. But I think to actively think about that and have sort of an idea for it can sometimes actually enable new things, and actually become maybe even the core of the concept in some cases. And then the third part, I think, is sort of, yeah, like really getting down with the nitty gritty of the realities of those two things. So like, do you have to incorporate yourself? Like, you know, that's something that I went through of like, you know, okay, how do I sign a lease so I'm not personally responsible for it? Like, how can we really make that a separate entity that then also other people can come into? That's sort of like all kinds of short-term bureaucracy to figure out, which we also together, I think, found out has less overlap between New York and Amsterdam than we might have hoped. But maybe in the future, like, I don't know if we can be of help to maybe German bureaucracy with you know, in comparison more. And obviously, if somebody were to open a node in America, I think there's much more advice you guys could give. But then also, yeah, long-term realities of like, you know, what, like, you know, the fund has been amazing, but like, we're not self-sufficient yet as post office, and the end of our runway is in sight. So like, what are our backup plans for when that were to happen? Where does that money come from? Just realistic questions and sort of worst case scenarios are I think something that you have to do to just reduce your risk. And then I think what's also been interesting as a mirror between Index and Post Office is that I think Index was very much had a community that you were giving space to, that you had been building up online. And I think in Amsterdam, it was very much like, let's open a space so then people can come and we can create that community. And that's something I think to think about, just because I definitely there is a path that comes with not having the community yet, and there's certain affordances from both sides. But I think that's something to consider of like, do you already have the community, and how do you make sure then that whatever space you're building is answering their needs? And in my case of like, how can I best sort of like try to figure out what the future community might need and try to build that in already. Those I think are kind of the things to go through when considering becoming an Index node.
Yeah, I mean, you've pretty much said this, but like, I would just add that like, I guess I was really inspired throughout my whole like I have been really inspired throughout my whole creative life, from like commune culture, Back to the Land, Drop City, like Arcosanti. And I would just say that like, nobody should open a space if they're not ready to be a business owner or a business manager. And if they're not ready to like learn from what's happened in the past and like set yourself up for success in the future. I mean, there was, I think, a lot of infighting. I think a lot of like financial mismanagement in the history of like collective space building. And if we have like the ability and like the perseverance, and because it's a lot of just diligence, it's a lot of just like maintenance, it's a lot of spreadsheets are maintenance, like same as washing dishes, same as making sure the cleaning person comes, same as anything. Like this stuff is like, it's just maintenance. And like, I think that a lot of people like love the idea of running a space like this, but when it comes down to like, getting into that nitty gritty stuff, like, and really being responsible for the implications of when it doesn't happen, like, I think you have to find the power of the maintenance work, and understand.
Be honest to yourself about it.
Yeah. You have to be honest with yourself about it, and you have to learn to embrace it. A wise man named Hugh Francis last year told me to stop being afraid of numbers. And that's really been like the most important thing that I've learned in the past year. And the only reason why I feel like I can do this work is because, it's math. It's not emotional. I mean,
I think it's so important to mention to like, know what you're getting into. Like, you're going to be running a space, you're going to be running a business, even if we're trying to set it up as the least businessy businesses, that is what it's going to be. And that takes either work or, again, like, bake that into the business model. Make sure that there is resources to pay somebody to do that work if you don't want to put your free, or if you don't have the free time to put into it. Like and even if you are, like, that's kind of like what we're running into now, or like, what I'm realizing is that, like, I knew ahead of time that, like, I had the free time to put into it, and so I wanted to set it up like that. But that is, yeah, like you said, it's a lot of work. You have to be wanting to do that and willing to do that, but also knowing that, like, down the line, we want to get to a place where some of the surplus can be used so that other people can take up some of these tasks, but also don't have to do it for free, because that's a privilege that few people have. So there's that, and I think it's really important to emphasize that. I would also say, though, from a personal experience, that at some point, setting up a business also means taking the plunge. Like, I was definitely at some point crunching numbers, trying to figure out the way to most reduce my financial risk. But at the end of the day, there is almost no way to not have some kind of risk attached to doing something like this. And that is also, at some point, you're going to have to sort of just take a leap of faith and know that as long as you've thought about it enough and sort of like done all the work you can, then And of course, knowing also that as an index node, you have the support of this amazing group of people. So you're not in it by yourself. That was for me also a very reassuring feeling. But I definitely remember having this moment where I was like, okay, I've crunched enough numbers. We're just gonna have to press go on this thing and believe in it also, obviously, like, because otherwise why are you doing it?
For sure. There's definitely, I think the right mindset for an index node operator is that your priority should be to serve the community in whatever way you can. And there's going to be like sacrifices that come along with that. You will sometimes have to like clean the bathroom, or empty the trash because no one else will. And when you start the space, there won't be enough money coming in to like pay someone to do that. So as long as your heart is in a place of, I'm going to do everything I can to create infrastructure to empower the artists and creative people who gravitate towards this space, then your heart's in the right space. And that includes trying to make the business financially sustainable, because if it doesn't have sustainability, then you're not serving that community well. You're setting them up for failure. So I think that, yeah, the right mindset for an index operator is to support the community, to make some sacrifices to allow it to exist, and to know that it'll get easier as more people hear about it and you build a reputation, but also you'll feel tremendously rewarded by just seeing these people come together and listening to some of the conversations that you never thought would even happen in this space. So yeah, that's the harsh reality of it. It's not a massively lucrative business, but it's massively rewarding for sure.
Yes, that's maybe a nice question. I'm curious, what has been, it can be very specifically anecdotal or just in general, like the most rewarding thing for you guys? Because I think for me, it's been just realizing the amount of interesting people that live in Amsterdam, which when it comes to like what do different cities needs, like New York, everybody knows in New York is full of interesting people. You can just sit on the corner and see that. But I think in Amsterdam, it's a bit less visible, and just, yeah, being like, holy shit, like you lived in Amsterdam for 5 years and I would have never met you if there wasn't this space. I think that's been for me the most rewarding thing, but I'm curious what of the last almost 6 months of opening has been for you.
So hard to say. I think, this is a little bit vague, but the surprise, I think that like I've been pleasantly surprised many times by like things that people suggest as potential programs or offerings. I've been surprised by like the people who come and sign up to be a member, who they are, what their backgrounds are, why they need a space like this. I've been surprised by like turnouts often. We had a screening last week of 2 short films made by, or one of them was made by the person who kind of organized the event, and the other one was made by his friend, and they're both kind of like Tokyo-based contemporary film shorts. And the guy who put it all together moved from Tokyo like earlier this year, and he was like, I know like only 6 people, like who are all these people, like there's 60 people showed up. He was like and so that surprise, right, like that element of like unpredictability, and as in my experience so far, it's been like positive surprise. I've never shown up and like the space has been robbed or whatever. That would be not a great surprise. But yeah, that's been really rewarding. I think especially after 3 years of like a pretty fucking predictable life in lockdown and work from home, definitely opening that back up.
Yeah. I was just going to quickly add, for me, there was like one really clear highlight, which was we'd been building the space for a bunch of months, and, we were posting about it and giving sort of like ad hoc messy updates on Insta. And, we eventually had our opening party, and our opening party might have had like 450, 500 people come through, which was shocking, because we thought it might have been like 150. And then what was even more shocking is me, Ellie, and Sam looked at each other and we were like, how many people would you say you actually know in this room? And we were all like, 5%? Like, who are all these people? We have no idea who they were. They were all so sweet, and we met a bunch of them. But that was just like crazy to us. Like, yeah, it really warmed my heart. I don't know, just to look around and be like, I don't know any of these people and I'm so happy they're here. So it's cool.
Yeah,
Okay, last
I
question.
recognize that feeling. Sorry, no, I think because there's so many events that, I was either organizing or were very close to my interests, but I think the moment where there was an event, the moment it was an event where, it was just like a whole other community that somebody brought in, and it was an event that I would have it was a book reading by it was a book reading of Cookie Mueller in celebration of the Nan Golden exhibition opening at a museum in Amsterdam, and it was just a group of different people that felt really close to Nan Goldin and to Cookie Mueller and wanted to do a reading of the book in celebration. And it was one of these events that I would just love to go to, and I went to it, and I was just there as a guest instead of as a host. And yeah, same thing. Like, I didn't know any of these people, and it was such a beautiful group of people and such a beautiful night. And then that feeling of like, yeah, there's this could happen in this space. Just like, yeah, that's really exciting. I think just broadening horizons in that way is really, really beautiful and exciting. The fuel for it, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, are you ready for last question? I don't have a hard stop, but I'm kind of curious, like, if we imagined a world, say 15 years, 20 years from now, in which like there are index nodes sort of self-operating around the world, and with regard to our kind of the principles that we talked about of these spaces, the way that they influence both the people like in their respective places and like contribute to a broader mycelial connective tissue. Like, why will third spaces like Index and Post Office change the world? Like, how will the world be changed? What effects will this network have on the world that we live in?
I was actually thinking about today. I was reading something about the entangled world and how we are both more aware of everything happening around the world and feel like we have some agency, but are also maybe aware of maybe not too much agency or as much as we would like. And how in moments of crisis, when the large institutions kind of fall back, the agency comes back to a very individual and local level, and how then all of a sudden, because you have to go step by step, that agency is increased. And I was just thinking about how these spaces are building those networks without necessarily like doing it for that intention, but just knowing that if we keep building community through the space, or some might say even when new crises will hit, there will be a basis of infrastructure for people to find each other and to organize towards those more pressing needs in those moments. So I think, I don't know, to me, there's something really beautiful about being able to do it through, it can be workshops that we're doing as well, but I think like having a space that can do something joyful, but actually build something very essential, that there's a sort of working in there. And I think that's sort of the world change that will hopefully emerge out of it, that we can work on really existential and essential infrastructure, if you will, or societal and social dynamics, but do it in a way that doesn't have to feel like homework or directly thinking in those sort of existential terms.
Yeah. Along those same lines, if I was to imagine an index, 10, 15, 20 years into the future and the impact that it might have had, I would like to think that because the way that we're approaching these spaces today is to create sort of like a safe space, a safe bubble, inside of the corpse of late capitalism, I would like to think that aesthetic alignment leads to more and more thinking and more philosophy being put out into the world that helps rally individuals and build collective power across this entire mesh. So for example, if Index in 5-10 years decides to open like a publishing house or something like that and starts to put out literature that actually empowers people in their workplace to take power back, and have like a little bit more of a push-pull with their employers or with the state, I would like to see these spaces being rails for that type of movement and that type of social change to happen, because a lot of that social change, at the quote grassroots level, happened in these ad hoc spaces, in these places that ephemeral, like a community garden or places that like aren't necessarily well suited for these types of conversations. And I would like Index to be a little bit more of a structural foundation for this type of work to propagate. So yeah, in 10-15 years time, I would like to see members who have strong opinions and strong philosophies actually publishing that work, it gaining traction, and Index being the rails that allowed it to make its way out into the world and change the lives of people who might actually go to their workplace and unionize it and do it successfully, with a lot of actual tools that our members have put out into the world. So
yeah, I love that. I think that building those rails, and like the way I see that as well, is like basically we're creating quite low stakes environments to practice social dynamics and create the tools that then hopefully can be applied to very high stake environments. So post office index space, like let's figure out what it's like to share resources with each other, to share a space with each other, what kind of rules are needed for that on the baseline, but also what kind of tools and ways of being and sharing actually work. And we can, we have the freedom in these spaces to sort of trial and error, because if it goes wrong, then your co-working space or your sort of like community hub cafe, something went wrong there, but it's not your place you depend on for your livelihood or your home or your food, like a farm, like you said, or a community garden. But hopefully, because we have the freedom to trial and error, our mistakes can then sort of be learned from and be applied to those more essential environments. Like that would also be my dream of like post office in 10 years has inspired lessons that are being applied to like new, community land trusts, new co-op housing projects, or even entire like eco communes. That would be, I think, incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that's something. When you were talking about like low stakes to high stakes, on like a societal level, right? We're practicing like a low stakes societal change right now. Like, I think it could also be really interesting to think about how this infrastructure can ladder up to more fulfilling personal, like high stakes personal goals or accomplishments. I'm thinking a lot about I've been thinking a lot about the nuclear family structure and how unsuccessful I think that was, or that has been. It's created really untenable family conditions and for the past the 70 years since post-war kind of suburban culture emerged. And I think if we can empower people to create new systems on a social level that can contribute to governance, can contribute to commerce, how can we also think about how these connections can contribute to a life well lived and a personal accomplishments and personal fulfillment that that can withstand the rising tides of a changing world. So yeah, has to be, I think, big on the big stage, and I think it also has to be integrated into all of our lives as well. Yeah, cool. Let's do it. Anything else we want to talk about? I mean, I know this was I don't want to abruptly end on that big note, but maybe we will.
No, I think it's a beautiful note to end on. And I think, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more specific questions or operational details we could get into if people wanted. And, if, I don't know, if people have specific questions, I know that all three of us are always available. People can reach out, through the expected channels. But also if people have questions that bubble up after this, maybe we just follow up with like a session where we answer some people's questions if they send them in. I'm sure there's much more knowledge to share, but I think this gives a great introduction to what we've been up to together for the last year and what has resulted in. It's been an amazing start of a journey, I think.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your ideas and taking the journey.
Thanks for enabling them.
Nice. And just like outside of the recording, but like on a more sort of practical note, I do think that with regard to giving support to nodes and helping nodes be more possible, like generally we probably can be sharing more resources and telling better stories about why people should engage with this network. Like me and Ellie have been using the word, this might give you the ick a little bit, but we've been using the word like, what's the customer journey of someone finding our social properties and then actually buying a desk, and that customer journey in our world is getting a little better, but it still has room to improve. And I think that telling the story of how Amsterdam fits into the picture and making Amsterdam feel more like a first-class citizen of the world that we're building is going to be important to that. And it will help you as well. Yeah.
But I think that like, this should be the comm strategy, like doing these, whether they're interviews or public conversations. Like, I think that like, this is a lot better than like, or supportive of, or more active than like a static post on social, like once every few months and like a landing page. Like, I think that this is a really like interesting content format. And, I've always
this is what
conversations, so.
Yeah, I think this is also what has been so clearly working throughout both of us, where we kind of started the conversation of some people might go to our Instagram, not fully get what we are, but then whenever they swing by and they talk to me or any of the other members, and we just kind of like talk it through, even though I feel like I'm saying the exact same thing that we put on that static page, somehow conversationally it just comes across better. And I think that might also be because what we're talking about is quite nuanced. And so, having the ability to put, I don't know, tonality and like a human voice behind that, I think helps make these ideas much clearer than if you just read them on a page. So I totally agree, having these conversations. And, again, if there's specific sides of the network or specific sides of the grant or specific sides of the nodes that we want to highlight, like let's just make another Notion doc of like specific questions and then do another talk around it. I think
or like we could even have a conversation about like, I could imagine us also like all reading something and responding to it, or like we can have a conversation about something that relates to these ideas that aren't like, and then it got hard when we had to do this, or whatever. Like, but I don't know, does like a monthly conversation like this that we can then like translate into different content, like record like a recording for Index Radio, a recording for Index Resources, cuts for social media, and then like a written interview. Does that like, I feel like that's a pretty like, that sets us up with a lot of stuff. And I don't know if a monthly cadence is like doable, but maybe we start there and then see.
Yeah, let's try. Yeah, I think it's really nice.
Yeah. Yep. I do think that we need to do some work though, generally, that's just like, there's nowhere on the internet that I'm aware of where like you can learn about the whole network and what it does and where it is and who's running it. And like, I just think that there needs to be some information architecture set up somewhere. Just to like, if you're curious, you click this one link and then it all makes sense, and then you can go about your day. Rather than like like piecing it together through this synesthesia of stuff you see in various places,
But I think what is the practical plan of like launching the grant? Is that something that is still sort of a work in progress, or you're just gonna like kind of do it more first, sort of behind the scenes, like less than an open call or something? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty up in the air. I think
Yeah.
like, it's been my intention to actually like reach out to the both of you and like figure it out soon.
Yeah.
We're not gonna get it out before the end of the year, but there's actually no rush to do that anymore because my new role at Garden 3D is like the collective manager basically, and I have like a budget to spend that isn't necessarily like year over. I have a year over year budget, but then I also have like a larger budget, which is not year over year. So this will come out of the larger budget. So we don't have to launch it by the end of this year, but I think it'd be cool to launch it like before the end of Q1 next year.
Yeah,
and
because I think, as you just said it about the informational architecture, like a sort of single page website that is just like, this is what the Index Node Network is about. This is who's part of it, Index Space and its post office. And this is who we hope will apply. And then even if there's not like an official first grand round, it could be like, reach out here if you're one of these people. And maybe, you know, because it is not that easy to just start a space. Like, I doubt 50 people are like, I'm ready to start a space, give me the money now. But if one person is, then maybe we can grant the third one already by the end of the year. Like, if somebody reaches out that similar to me was like, oh, I actually been thinking about it already for 2 years. I live in Prague and this is my plan. You know, who knows what happens? But yeah, that can't happen until we have like a clear page for it, or something at least that's communicating that then this conversation can live on right away as well. So I'm happy that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, can we maybe start with just this existing on Notion, because
yeah, exactly.
I feel like we've had a lot of conversations with our the folks who work on our design of starting this there, but it's fits and starts. It's not consistent enough to actually get something out. And I think it would be better if we just if we set this, put the first foot forward, and then like if we get design resources, or if I just like design it at, you know, some random night, then like that can work, but at least we have something to start with.
Yeah, I
happy
think
to feed
the first foot forward, I think, is just let's get a Notion page which is apply to be an index operator, and in that page, you know, ideally it's like, here's the existing nodes, you know, some photos, you know, and here's what's expected of you. We talk a little bit about the aspects of, you know, being community facing and serving your community. We talk a little bit about the financial reality of running one of these spaces, and then we just have like an apply button, which maybe is like a Google form or something. And that's all we need to do to get it out. And then we just make some social posts and send it out to some mailers. And I think we'll get a bunch of interesting people, like maybe 5 or 8 would be cool. Yeah, and then I think that we should have all of our members essentially vote, or, you know, for some sort of like way of choosing, like who we think is going to do the best job and who we think has the most interesting vision. So
yeah, love that.
Yeah, so that really nice. I mean, all of that can come together pretty quick, and I think it can live on Notion. I don't think it has to be a website.
Yeah,
right. I think the whole
it
can always live on Notion. Yeah,
I mean, there is a place where I want the index site to have information about index on it.
It should. Yeah, I know. It's just when I start thinking about that, it's oh, we should redo the homepage, and then we should redo like a sub page which is called like network or IRL or something. And yeah, it's too complicated. So like, I think if we want to get the RFC out for grants, let's just send a Notion page to our socials.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
But I agree.
Happy to help write that up as well. And so Ellie, if you and I want to just ping that Notion doc back and forth over the next, you know, few weeks, and then I think it can be online very quickly indeed.
Yeah, let's do that.
I think that's the last milestone in your deal contract, right, Brian?
True. Yeah.
So if we knock it out, and it really doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be like fairly simple FAQ with some photos. And nice. then we can get you paid for that final milestone, which we'll wrap.
Perfect.
Yeah, all of that. So yeah, I'd love to see that come together, and I can for sure help.
I wanted to share one more thing also outside of the recording, because I don't really know yet. I think at some point it will hopefully be it can be a lesson for public, but we had our first weird incident at post office this week, or was it this week? Yeah, it was where Tuesday night we had our book club, and so strange. Like it was like Halloween edition, sort of, but nobody came really dressed up because